think I'm going to get some angry comments about this video, probably from people who haven't watched the video properly. They'll tell me that the loco that I'm featuring in today's video was not Hornby's first locomotive. They'll tell me that Hornby's first locomotive was one of these old O-gauge tinplate 040s released in 1920, something a little bit like this. Or perhaps in 00 scale, they'll name some of the first Hornby 00 locomotives, such as the N2 like this, or perhaps the A4, which was another early one. And while it is true that these models were the first to bear Hornby's name, I've got bad news for people that think that. That Hornby died in 1964. The present day Hornby isn't really Hornby at all. By 1964, the Hornby that made this locomotive owned quite a few different toy brands, and all of them were failing. Meccano, a classic and very well-loved construction toy, was being absolutely thrashed by Lego, whose much simpler plastic bricks had grown much more popular and also much more affordable than the complex and metal Meccano. Their dinky toy range, which specialised in manufacturing die-cast cars and similar vehicles, was also struggling under intense competition from rivals Corgi and Matchbox. And then of course came their flagship brand, their model railways range, Hornby 00, and the list of issues with this range goes on and on. First of all, they only allowed their range to be stocked in one shop per town. This was a truly horrible business strategy which reduced the number of customers that were exposed to the brand. It also made Hornby 00 extremely unpopular with the other retailers who couldn't stock their products. What does that remind you of? Anyway, at this point we need to introduce another key player into this situation, and that was Triang. The Triang Railways range that was introduced in the early 1950s was sold in as many toy and model shops that would have them. This raised the profile of the brand massively because it would appear in shops all over the high street. Also, it made them massively popular with retailers who welcomed them with open arms and even willingly promoted them. Compare this to Hornby 00, who had just one shop per town selling them, and it's easy to see why they were struggling. But it wasn't just this, there were other enormous problems with the Hornby 00 range too. Triang's models used plastic bodies and they were very affordable to buy, whereas Hornby 00's locomotives were metal bodied. And obviously this was great, this made them feel much heavier, it made them better quality, but it also made them much more expensive than Triang. And despite the plastic construction, Triang's models were getting better and better in detail, and arguably their level of detail was starting to surpass Hornby 00 in many areas, as much as Triang's engines still had things like moulded plastic handrails and not separately fitted ones. Another massive problem with Hornby 00 was that historically their system was a 3-rail system, but Triang's system used 2 rails, which was obviously much more realistic, and it became incredibly popular. And so this caused a big problem for Hornby 00, and the obvious solution to that problem would be to switch from 3-rail to 2-rail, like Triang. But the problem with that was that their existing customer base, the customers that had invested a fortune in the 3-rail system, would be incredibly angry at the prospect of their very expensive model railway being rendered obsolete. So what did Hornby 00 do? Well, they introduced a 2-rail range in addition to their 3-rail range, and they tried to maintain both ranges simultaneously. And this was another horrible strategy. It ended up costing them a fortune. For every single 3-rail model they made, they would also have to make a 2-rail version of that model and also distribute it and market it and sell it too. This was horribly impractical and it caused them to hemorrhage money fast. In 1964, Meccano Limited finally collapsed, taking Hornby 00 with it. They'd been losing money for years and they were in massive amounts of debt. Their biggest competitor, Triang, bought the Hornby 00 range and absorbed it into their own system. This is where the original Hornby timeline ends. The Hornby we know today is not Hornby. The company that brought us these tinplate locomotives and the old Hornby 00 locomotives has been dead and buried for over 60 years. The company we know today as Hornby is Triang, they just happen to be using the Hornby name. Following the acquisition in 1964, the name of the company was changed to Triang Hornby, but this was mainly done to appease the fans of Hornby 00 as a way to kind of assure them that the brand they loved was not gone. But it was gone. Triang killed off the Hornby 00 brand. As much as it was loved by some, it was flawed and it didn't make any money ultimately, so they did kill it off. Now when I say Triang killed the range, that is to say they stopped producing it, at least for the most part. There was a few bits and bobs they carried on making. But that isn't to say they stopped selling the range. Why? Because when they inherited the brand, they also inherited masses of unsold stock, which was very, very difficult to sell. Now what they could have done was to discount the price of all of this stock and sell it to trade at very, very low prices and get rid of it that way. But they were frightened that flooding the market with loads of cut price models would damage their own brand. It would devalue their own Triang brand and potentially hurt their own sales. So they didn't do that. Instead, they maintained the original prices and carried on selling the range as usual. And it took them forever to shift this stock. And I'm not talking about just a year or two, I mean a seriously long time. Famously, Hattons of Liverpool, who we'll all know of course, they bought a lot of the unsold stock and it took them 30 years to shift it. 30 years and they still had these old models in stock. An absolutely crazy story. So Triang did keep selling the old Hornby models, not because they had any value, but because the alternative was sending all of that unsold stock to landfill. But no doubt about it, they did kill off the Hornby 00 range. Now, some parts of this range would see the light of day again when some of the more popular models were passed on to their Wren division, allowing some of the better locos to be put back into production, but now as 2-rail only locomotives, they did away with the 3-rail stuff, and also with updated couplings so that the old Hornby 00 stuff, now Wren, was compatible with the Triang stuff and it would work in terms of couplings and such. Fast forward to 1971 and due to the pressures of a changing market, Triang, or the Lines Brothers, collapsed as well, and the Lines Brothers brands had to be sold off. The railway brand was bought, but this time it continued to operate more or less as it was. The team was kept and the brand wasn't absorbed into another company and effectively killed as the Hornby 00 brand had been. But now the Triang name couldn't be used anymore, and I think that's because Triang was the name for the Lines Brothers. There was 3 brothers, Triang. I think that's where that name came from. Obviously, Lines Brothers went out of business, so for whatever reason, that name couldn't be used anymore. And so from 1971, the name was changed to Hornby Railways, as it remains to this day. But I should say the Hornby Railways name had no significance to it. They literally only chose to use this name because the old name Triang Railways couldn't be used anymore. They didn't adopt the name Hornby because the range had anything at all to do with Hornby. It was just a convenient name to choose. And in fact, it would be at this point, 1972, when the Triang range and the original Hornby 00 range would part ways. Remember how I said the brands were all sold off in 1971 following the Lines Brothers collapse? Well, George Wren, who oversaw the Wren division, saw an opportunity to make the Wren brand independent, and he bought out Triang's share of the company and went his own separate way, taking the Hornby 00 toolings with him, or what remained of them. And the true irony of all of this, of course, was that the company known as Hornby Railways now no longer had control of the old Hornby models. That's a strange one, isn't it? So to cut a very long story short, the Hornby we know today descends from Triang and not from Meccano Limited or Hornby 00. So to find out what the Hornby we know today's first locomotive was, we have to ask what was Triang's first locomotive, and that's easy. In a word, it is this. It is the 1950 Princess Royal class. Now my example is from a little bit later on, it's from 1951 instead of 1950, but it's very similar and it uses the same body tooling or moulding. So in 1950, Rovex Plastics, as they were then known, were commissioned by Marks and Spencers, of all people, that's pretty awesome, isn't it, to produce 60,000 train sets for them, which I think is an enormous number of train sets, at least by today's standards. But ultimately 60,000 train sets were not produced. They ended up delivering far fewer than that, mainly because the train sets were crap. They released the train set way too early, long before it was properly ready, really, and they spent the next several years trying to tweak it and fix it in an attempt to make the train set actually usable. See, I told you the Hornby we know today descends from these guys. Only joking, Hornby. The Princess Royal class was chosen because whoever made the decision thought that it was the biggest, the fastest and the most famous engine running at the time, which of course it wasn't. The LMS Coronation class was larger, the A4 was faster, and even in those days the Flying Scotsman was more famous, so why they thought the Princess fit the bill I don't know, but ultimately it was chosen. The original 1950 locomotive actually had a plastic chassis, which seems unbelievable by today's standards, but it did indeed. And this, sure enough, caused all sorts of problems. And it's all of the problems you'd expect, knowing what we know today about model trains. So too light, not enough traction, and it struggled to pick up electricity because the pickup rollers weren't being pushed hard enough onto the track. So what was the solution? Well, obviously the correct solution was to make the chassis out of metal. But that was not the solution they chose. What did they do instead? Well, they plundered their own factory roof for the lead and put that lead into the locomotives to make them heavier. Again, that is an absolutely crazy story. So the first Hornby or Triang locomotives actually went out to customers with bits of the factory roof crammed inside the bodies to make them a little bit heavier. Couldn't believe it when I read that. This still didn't work though, the chassis were still rubbish, and so from 1951 a new metal chassis was devised, and that's the one I've got, but it's still a very primitive chassis. As you can see, it's made up of two side plates which are held apart by spacers, and then we've got these sections of laminate, which is effectively thin layers of metal sandwiched together, which also help to space the two main plates, and they also give a bit more weight to the chassis. The original 1950 locomotive used roller pickups which actually rolled along the track to pick up electricity. As a consequence of that, the wheels of the locomotive were not used to pick up power, and as such they were made of plastic. And this example of mine from 1950 doesn't have the roller pickups because they didn't work properly either. This has plunger style pickups, which means that my version also does not pick up power from the wheels, and these wheels are indeed made of plastic. I think it's quite hard to tell that because they still look exactly the same as the later metal wheels, but no, they are actually plastic wheels. And I've not tried this yet. In theory, these plunger pickups were better than the rollers because they're sprung and they push down onto the rails, but I've not tried this yet. I'm going to give this a first try later on, and I'm quite excited to see what happens. Hopefully it won't just be a big anticlimax. So because Rovex had to spend so many years improving, upgrading and fixing the train set that they released before it was ready to be released, they actually burnt through all of their money, and it was at this point that Lines Brothers, or Triang, bought the brand and they made a lot of improvements to the business side of things. Under Triang, or the Lines Brothers, the Princess would evolve over the years to become a very fine model indeed. This is what it looked like much later on, after a lot of the improvements. It would eventually receive proper metal wheels with pickups on them, which meant that the plungers were no longer necessary, and the paint jobs would be significantly improved over the years as well, making them look more realistic than ever. But we've seen loads of those later Princesses on this channel. I've done videos on those before. Check out the link up there if you're interested. What I've never done is demonstrated a locomotive as early as this, one with the plunger pickups and the plastic wheels. So with some trepidation, that's what we're going to do today. We'll take a close look at this. I'll show you some of the unexpected features that it's got, and then we'll put this onto the track and see if I can coax this 1951 locomotive to work. So first of all, a lot of the early Triang models were made from a pretty primitive plastic really called cellulose acetate. And you can recognise cellulose acetate because it tends to be a lot glossier and shinier than the polystyrene that they used later on. Another characteristic of the cellulose acetate was its tendency to warp. And look at this around the front buffer beam, it's bending upwards. and this was a big problem with the cellulose acetate. And in fact, there are lots of early Triang coaches made from this material which are also bent like a banana. And you can only imagine what the original plastic chassis must have been like if they'd started to warp and bend like this. Yeah, it's no wonder they changed to a metal chassis, is it? Anyway, they eventually changed the plastic to a polystyrene, which solved a lot of these problems. Detail-wise, a feature that surprised me is the moulded running number in the front of the smoke box. So originally they only made this particular model, Princess Elizabeth number 46201, so they could mould the number into the front here. Later on though, they wanted to make other Princess class locos, so the tooling was modified to have this number removed so that numbers could be printed on here instead, but a lot of mine don't have anything on that at all, as you can see. Another surprise here are these safety valves. I've not seen a Triang Princess with this style of safety valve before. As you can see, there are 4 safety valves here, which is correct. Later models were modified to have these turned metal separately fitted safety valves, but only 2 of them, which is incorrect. So I think the metal safety valves look better, but these moulded plastic ones are more realistic. It's very interesting. Also, the decoration is done with heat printing, so the side of the loco cab, that's a good example. So I think they would use a tool a bit like a brand that would be really hot. It'd have these numbers moulded into it, and that would be pressed onto the side of the cab to make a physical indentation where these numbers were, and then that could be painted. The tender looks a little bit worse for wear, but you can see that the early British Railways crest here with the lion on it, that has been physically melted into the side of the tender. Again, this process would eventually be abandoned for just printed crests and paintwork, which is obviously the way we do it today. Another big deal is the tender. Now, the original Princess tender was not very realistic. It was kind of the wrong height, the wrong length, and so was the locomotive for that matter. But later on, they wanted to fix this. Now, the locomotive couldn't be fixed because to make that the correct length and the correct height, whatever, they would have to have redesigned a new chassis, and that chassis was used for all sorts of different models, so to do that would have cost too much. But it was decided that the tender could more easily be fixed, and so a new tender was eventually designed. Now this is the new tender. As you can see, it's got a lot more detail around the back. Its proportions look a lot more like the real Princess. But yeah, this is the original tender, which is quite cool to see. And let's have a look at a 1951 coal load. Look at that, that is really, really good. I would say even by modern standards, that would look acceptable. Impressive. Anyway, let's take the body off and see what we've got inside. And to do this, I have to loosen this screw inside the chimney as per the original body fixing method. On later models, the screw will be down here. Early on though, it's inside the chimney, which is more realistic, isn't it? This way you don't have a visible screw on the front of the running plate. Anyway, unscrewing. Goodness, I feel like I'm opening King Tut's tomb or something. It's very possible that the inside of this model has not been seen for 60 odd years. Now, oh, it's coming off. Oh, look at this. Right. What are we seeing then? So we've all heard of the XO4 and XO3 motors. We're very familiar with them. This is the Mark 1 motor, or the XO1 motor, which you might not have heard of. So this is like the precursor to that motor. And the biggest difference is that the commutator is a flat disc-shaped commutator which faces forwards. I understand this was not very effective, and the XO3 or XO4 motor had a circular drum-shaped commutator like this, which worked better. But there we go, that's the original motor. No brushes either, the brushes are literally just copper contacts. I don't think I've seen one of those before. And then of course we've got the laminate here, which is just, how many layers is that? Looks like 7 layers sandwiched together and riveted to the loco chassis to make it a little bit heavier. What a fascinating chassis that is. And then of course here are the pickups, which have the wires soldered to them, and this wire's broken, so the loco's not going to work. But I suppose what I should do, and this is going to be really exciting, as I'm going to fix this, I'll solder this back in position, then we will put this onto the track and see if it works. And I'm not going to do too much running with this before I've serviced or repaired it, but I'm very curious to see if this thing will run. Okay, so I think this could be the oldest loco ever to grace these rails. And I am quite nervous about trying this. I don't know what the chances of success here are. I would guess probably less than 10% because I've not done anything to this yet. I've not oiled it or lubricated it. I just want to see what this does after all these years with a little bit of power. So gingerly, let's apply some juice and let's see if there's any signs of life at all. Here we go. I'm turning up. Nothing's happened. Okay, not a big surprise. Okay, it's dead. So I will strip this down. I'll see what I can do to improve it, and then we'll come back and I'll see if I can get this 1951 locomotive to run. It's not a guarantee, but we can try. Right, so it's only been about 5 minutes. I've not done much to this at all. I've cleaned the plunger pickups. I've cleaned the commutator of the motor, which is not easy to do. These are not serviceable motors, really. The brushes don't seem to be easily removable, and removing the motor is a chore as well, so I did that in position. Let's see, I lubricated the motor, and I've seen signs that this might be alive now. So I've popped the body back on, I've started the camera again, I've got it down onto the track. Let's see if there is life here now. A little power, here we go. Oh, there is. Oh, I've been able to show it working on camera. I'm so pleased. Plastic wheels, of course. Oh, needs a nudge. But there we have it. I've now been able to demonstrate a loco working with plunger pickups. Oh dear, it's come off on the points. Yeah, it does not like the points for obvious reasons. It's got very big chunky wheels. I don't think I can send this off around the layout, can I? I suppose I could try, but I'll need to manually advance it over the points. So, trying to go. Oh, come on, I want a 1951 loco to run up Gordon's Hill. Yeah, it's not happy. Sorry about the camera work. Oh, I think it'll do it if we can get it round the bend. There we go. All right. So there's no guarantee that this loco is running as it would have run in 1951. Perhaps when brand new, these would have been a lot better, but it's not exactly an impressive performance, is it? The reliability, thanks to the plunger pickups, isn't great. It's very easy to see why they decided to change that system and make some upgrades. But still, the fact that we've seen this work 60 odd years later is absolutely amazing. And this thing, by the way, was not expensive. They're not rare or sought after or anything like that. It cost me just less than £30 on eBay. So if this is something you want to own, a little bit of history, even if it's not to run, just to have and look at, they are available and you can still get them. So that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed learning a little bit about Hornby's first locomotive. And I want to say a thank you to Guru Larry, of all people, I know, for coming up with the idea for this one. I thought it sounded like a good idea, so I decided to do it. And if you're interested in retro video games and that sort of thing, check out Guru Larry's channel. I'll pop a link down there. For now though, that will just about wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Comment down below, let me know what you think. Also, if you or Guru Larry have similar ideas in a similar vein, do let me know what those are and I'll look at doing videos on those. For now though, that will wrap it up. Thank you ever so much for watching and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers folks, you take care.